The splintering of wood was the only warning. Father Lorenzo de Mesquita felt his ribs compress as the surging crowd pinned him against the temple gate, the air punched from his lungs in a desperate gasp. Around him, a sea of bodies heaved and roared, a human tsunami breaking against the flimsy wooden structures of Shokokuji Temple in Kyoto. This wasn't the sound of anger, it was the sound of pure, uncontrollable awe, and it was far more terrifying. March 23, 1581. The day had started with the delicate ceremony of an audience with a minor daimyo, but it had devolved into a sea-wide riot. Mesquita and his fellow Jesuits were trapped, their small retinue of Japanese converts struggling to form a protective ring, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a fishing net. People were climbing onto rooftops, their faces a mixture of fear and manic excitement. Others were being trampled underfoot, their cries lost in the din. The Jesuits had seen sword battles, faced down pirates, and navigated treacherous political courts, but they had never encountered anything like this. And at the center of the storm, the cause of it all, stood a single man, utterly calm. He was over 6 feet tall, a giant in a land of shorter men, with skin the color of night and muscles like coiled steel ropes. He wasn't a demon or a god, as the screaming crowd seemed to believe, but his presence had broken the city of Kyoto. To understand how this one man could shatter the composure of Japan's imperial capital, you have to understand the world he had just entered. The year 1581 was deep within the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. For over a century, Japan had been a fractured land of endless civil war. The authority of the emperor and the shogun had crumbled, leaving a power vacuum filled by ambitious regional warlords, the daimyo, who battled each other for supremacy with armies of samurai. It was a brutal, honor-bound, and deeply traditional society. It was also, for the most part, completely isolated. The Japanese people knew of China, of Korea, but the world beyond that was the stuff of myth and legend. The arrival of Portuguese traders and Jesuit missionaries a few decades earlier had been a profound shock, introducing firearms, Christianity, and men with pale skin and light-colored eyes. But even that could not prepare them for the man who accompanied the Jesuit visitor, Alessandro Valignano. Valignano was no ordinary priest. He was the Vatican's plenipotentiary for the entire East Indies, a towering figure himself, both in stature and in authority. His mission was monumental, to adapt the Catholic faith to the cultures of the East, a controversial idea at the time. He believed that to convert Japan, the Jesuits couldn't act like European conquerors. They had to understand and respect Japanese customs. They had to become, in a sense, more Japanese than the Japanese. When he arrived in Japan for the first time in 1579, he brought with him a retinue designed to impress and to serve, and as his personal bodyguard and valet, he brought a man he had acquired in his travels, likely in Portuguese Mozambique or India. History does not record this man's birth name, his tribe, or his history. He was simply Valignano's attendant, a footnote in the Jesuits' grand mission. But that was about to change.
Their journey began in the port of Kuchinotsu in July 1579. From the moment the African giant stepped off the ship, reality in Japan seemed to bend around him. In a society where homogeneity was the absolute norm, he was a walking miracle, a being who defied all known categories. The local Japanese stared, their work forgotten. They pointed, they whispered. Was he a daikokuten, a god of wealth, often depicted with dark skin? Or was he an oni, a demon from the underworld? They had no frame of reference. The Jesuits' own records describe him as having the strength of 10 men. He was young, likely in his early 20s, and his physique was not merely imposing, it was a testament to a life of hardship and strength. While Valignano preached and negotiated, his bodyguard became a local legend. Rumors of his power spread from village to village, faster than the Jesuits could travel. People would walk for miles, lining the roads, just to catch a glimpse of the Kurobozu, the Black Page. For 2 years, Valignano and his entourage traveled through the domains of various Christian and sympathetic daimyo in the south. The African's presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he drew immense crowds, giving the missionaries an audience they could only have dreamed of. On the other hand, the spectacle often overshadowed the message. The people came to see the giant, not to hear about the gospel. Yet, through all of this, the man himself remained a quiet, dignified presence. He learned Japanese with remarkable speed, absorbing not just the language, but the complex etiquette that governed every interaction. He moved with a warrior's economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning, always aware of his duty to protect Valignano.
He was a professional in a world of gawking amateurs. The ultimate destination of their journey was the heart of power in Japan. Not the emperor in his gilded cage in Kyoto, but the de facto ruler of the nation, the man who was systematically crushing his rivals and was on the verge of unifying the entire country under his iron will, Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was a figure of shocking contradictions. He was known as the Demon King, a ruthless and brutal military commander who had burned thousands of Buddhist monks alive at their monastery on Mount Hiei for defying him. He slaughtered men, women, and children who stood in his way. Yet, he was also a brilliant strategist and a visionary. He was one of the first daimyo to recognize the power of firearms, equipping his peasant-heavy armies with thousands of arquebuses and drilling them relentlessly. With these weapons, his forces smashed the traditional samurai cavalry charges of his rivals, most famously at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. He was a patron of the arts, a lover of tea ceremony, and possessed a burning curiosity for all things new and foreign. He despised the ossified traditions of the Japanese court and the political power of the Buddhist temples. In the Jesuits, he saw not a spiritual path, but a strategic tool, a link to European technology, trade, and firearms, and a cultural counterweight to his Buddhist enemies. He had granted the Jesuits land and permission to build a church in the capital, and now the great visitor Valignano was coming to meet him in person. In the spring of 1581, Valignano's party made its way towards the central provinces, Nobunaga's heartland. The stories of the Black Giant had preceded them, growing more fantastical with every telling. By the time they reached the outskirts of Kyoto, the man was no longer a man. He was a legend, a myth walking the earth. And when they entered the city, the legend collided with reality. The entire capital, a city of over 100,000 people, seemed to stop. Merchants left their stalls, artisans dropped their tools, samurai retainers abandoned their posts. A crowd began to form, then to swell, then to surge. This was the chaos that had trapped Father Mesquita against the temple gate. The local authorities, completely overwhelmed, sent frantic messages to their lord. They reported that a riot had broken out, that a temple was on the verge of being destroyed, and that several people had been crushed to death, all because a Jesuit priest had brought a black man with him. The report flew up the chain of command until it reached the one man who could restore order with a single word. It reached Oda Nobunaga. From his newly constructed Azuchi Castle, a magnificent 7-story fortress that towered over Lake Biwa, Nobunaga received the news. Lesser men might have been angered by the disruption, by the challenge to their authority, but Nobunaga was not a lesser man. His reaction was not anger, but intense, immediate curiosity. A man who could cause a riot just by existing? A being from a land so far away he might as well have been from the moon? This was exactly the kind of novelty, the kind of exotic rarity that Nobunaga craved. He collected strange rocks, imported tigers, and European wine. A man like this was the ultimate collectible. He immediately dispatched a squad of his personal guards. Their orders were not to disperse the crowd or arrest the Jesuits.
Their orders were to bring the foreigners, and especially the Black Giant, to him at once. Back at the temple, the doors finally gave way, splintering inwards. The crowd poured into the courtyard, a wave of humanity, desperate to see the man whose skin was said to be the color of the ink they used for calligraphy. Valignano, Mesquita, and the other priests feared the worst. They were about to be torn apart by a mob driven mad by a phenomenon they couldn't comprehend. The African bodyguard stood his ground, a rock in the churning sea, his hand never straying far from the hilt of the sword at his side. He was ready to die for Valignano. Just then, the sound of war horns cut through the air. The crowd flinched. A column of samurai, their armor lacquered black and bearing the distinctive flower crest of the Oda clan, forced their way through the mob. They didn't bother with pleasantries. They used the butts of their spears to create a path, their authority absolute and terrifying. The captain of the guard, a veteran with a scar that split his left eyebrow, strode up to Valignano. He bowed curtly, a gesture of respect dictated by his master's policy, but his eyes were fixed on the African man standing beside the Jesuit. The samurai's face, normally a mask of stoic indifference, was alight with a flicker of disbelief. "Oda-sama summons you," the captain announced, his voice rough. "All of you. He wishes to see the man." A hush fell over the immediate vicinity. A direct summons from Nobunaga was not a request. It was an absolute command, one that could end in either immense favor or a swift, brutal death.
Alessandro Valignano, the calculating diplomat of the church, knew this was the single most important moment of his mission in Japan. The fate of Christianity in the country could be decided in the next few hours. He looked at his bodyguard, the man who had served him faithfully, the man who had inadvertently brought the power of the most dangerous warlord in Japan crashing down upon them. He saw no fear in the man's eyes, only a quiet readiness. He had faced down pirates, soldiers, and now a rioting mob. He would now face a king. Valignano nodded to the samurai captain. The path was cleared, and under the watchful eyes of thousands of silent onlookers, the small party of Jesuits and their African guardian were escorted through the streets of Kyoto, on their way to a private audience with the demon king. They were walking into the heart of power, and into a moment that would change the bodyguard's life and the course of samurai history forever. Forever. The procession moved through a city that had been shocked into silence. The roar of the mob was replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the samurai's lacquered armor and the heavy tread of their war sandals on the packed earth. Thousands of eyes followed them, but from a respectful distance, held back by the palpable aura of lethal authority that radiated from the Oda clan guards. The African walked beside Valignano, his towering frame a stark silhouette against the low-slung wooden buildings of the capital. He was no longer the center of a chaotic spectacle. He was now a formal curiosity, an object of intense scrutiny being delivered for inspection. The air itself seemed to have changed.
It was no longer thick with the sweat and noise of a crowd, but thin and sharp with the tension of high politics and mortal danger. They were being taken to Honnochi, a sprawling Buddhist temple complex that Nobunaga had commandeered as his personal headquarters in Kyoto. It was not a palace of soft silks and delicate art, but a fortified command post, a predator's den nestled in the heart of the city he controlled. As they passed through the temple's main gate, flanked by guards whose hands never left the hilts of their katana, the world of the common street vanished. Here was a realm of raked gravel, manicured pines, and silent, watchful men. Every corridor they were led through held more samurai, sitting rigidly in the formal seiza position, their swords placed carefully at their side. They were not just guards, they were the elite, the personal retainers of the Demon King, men who had waded through rivers of blood to bring their master to the brink of total power. Their gazes were like stones, hard and unreadable, yet every single one was fixed on the dark-skinned giant. There was no shouting or pointing here, only a deep, unnerving stillness, the collective assessment of hundreds of professional killers. They were ushered into a vast audience chamber. The paper shoji screens had been slid open to the temple gardens, filling the room with cool afternoon light. The air smelled of sandalwood incense and polished cypress wood. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, a single man sat on a silk cushion. He was in his late 40s, a whip-thin man of wiry strength, dressed not in armor but in a simple, dark kimono.
His face was narrow, with a high-bridged nose and eyes that seemed to burn with a restless, impatient fire. He held a war fan in one hand, tapping it idly against his palm. This was Oda Nobunaga. Surrounding him were his most trusted vassals and attendants, including his handsome young page and confidant, Mori Ranmaru. They were the most powerful men in Japan, but in their master's presence, they were utterly still, their deference absolute. Alessandro Valiano, a man used to commanding the respect of princes and viceroys, felt a knot of cold dread in his stomach. He performed the deep, formal bow required, his fellow priests following suit. The African, having been instructed in the customs, also bowed, his movements precise and dignified. For a long moment there was only silence, broken by the tapping of the fan. Nobunaga's eyes ignored Valiano completely. They were locked on to the African, scanning him from head to foot with an intensity that was almost physical. He took in the man's height, the breadth of his shoulders, the power evident in his arms and chest. A slow, incredulous smile spread across the warlord's face. "So," Nobunaga's voice was surprisingly high-pitched, but carried an undeniable edge of command. "The rumors are true. You bring a demon god to my city, Valiano Dono." Valiano, speaking through a Japanese Jesuit interpreter, began to explain. "He is no demon, Lord Nobunaga. He is a man from the territories in Africa under the influence of the Portuguese crown. He is my valet and my guard." Nobunaga let out a short, sharp laugh. "A man? Do not lie to me, priest. His skin is black. It must be ink. The Portuguese are fond of such tricks to impress the simple-minded." He gestured with his fan.
"Bring him here." 2 guards stepped forward. The African looked to Valignano, who gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "Do not resist." He walked forward, his footsteps silent on the tatami mats, and stopped at the base of the platform. He stood before the most powerful man in Japan, his fate hanging on the warlord's whim. "Take off your robes," Nobunaga commanded. The order was blunt, humiliating. The room was deathly quiet. Slowly, the man untied his sash and let his simple outer garment fall to the floor, revealing his bare torso. A collective, quiet intake of breath hissed through the assembled samurai. They were warriors, men who prided themselves on their physical conditioning, but none of them had ever seen a physique like this. He was a living statue of sculpted muscle, his skin gleaming like polished obsidian in the soft light. Nobunaga leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He clearly did not believe what he was seeing. "It is a clever deception," he declared. "A fine powder, perhaps, or a dye made from crushed charcoal. Wash him." This was the ultimate test, the moment of truth. Mori Ranmaru snapped his fingers, and servants scurried in with a large wooden tub of water and soft cloths. The guards gestured for the African to kneel by the tub. For a fleeting second, a flicker of defiance hardened his eyes. He was a warrior, not a spectacle to be scrubbed like a dirty pot. But he understood the stakes. He saw the tension in Valignano's face. He knelt. A servant began to scrub his arm, tentatively at first, then with more force. The water in the tub remained clear. The skin remained black. Another servant joined in, scrubbing his back, his chest. The samurai watched in stunned silence, their stoic masks finally beginning to crack. This was not paint. This was not a trick. Nobunaga rose from his cushion and descended from the dais, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked right up to the kneeling man and crouched down, his face inches from the wet skin. He reached out and touched the man's shoulder, rubbing his thumb against the flesh as if testing the texture of a rare fabric. The skin was real. The man was real. Nobunaga stood up and began to laugh. It was not a gentle chuckle, but a full-throated, delighted roar of genuine astonishment. "Incredible," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the chamber. "He is truly black, all the way through." The tension in the room shattered. The Demon King was not displeased. He was mesmerized. He circled the man, examining him like a master craftsman inspecting a flawless sword. "What is your name?" he asked, looking directly at him. Before the interpreter could speak, the man answered himself, his voice a low baritone, his Japanese accented but clear. "I have no name that is known here, my lord." Nobunaga's eyebrows shot up. Not only was this creature real, but it could speak, and it understood the nuances of honorific language. The warlord's fascination deepened into something more, respect. "How old are you?" "I believe I am 26 or 27 years of my people's counting," he replied. "And your homeland? What is it like?"
For the next hour, Oda Nobunaga, the unifier of Japan, the man who held the lives of millions in his hand, held a private conversation with a nameless African bodyguard. He asked about the animals of Africa, about the wars between tribes, about the journey across the great oceans.
He was not just interrogating him, he was trying to comprehend a world so utterly alien from his own. The man answered with a quiet intelligence and honesty that clearly impressed Nobunaga far more than his physical strength. He spoke of a life of hardship, of being sold or captured, of a long and brutal journey that had eventually led him into the service of the Jesuits. He presented himself not as a victim, but as a survivor, a warrior. Finally, Nobunaga clapped his hands together. "A man of such caliber cannot be nameless," he declared to the room. "From this day forward, you will be known as Yasuke." The name itself, Yasuke, was a common one, but the act of bestowing it was anything but. In feudal Japan, a lord naming a subordinate was a profound act of acceptance, of binding that person to them. With that single word, Nobunaga had severed the man's ties to the Jesuits. He had erased his past as a foreign servant and given him a new identity, a Japanese identity, as a member of the Oda clan's extended household. He turned to Valignano. "This man is wasted on you, priest. His strength is that of 10 men. His mind is bright and his spirit is strong. I am taking him into my service." It was not a request. Nobunaga tossed a heavy purse of gold at Valignano's feet. "A gift for your church and for bringing me this rare treasure." Valignano was trapped. His primary bodyguard, a man who had served him loyally, was being taken from him, but his entire mission, the future of Catholicism in Japan, depended on this warlord's favor. To refuse would be suicide, both for him and for his cause. He bowed deeply. "My Lord Nobunaga honors us."
"Yasuke will serve you well." That evening, Nobunaga held a great feast. Yasuke, no longer a guard standing in the corner, was given a seat of honor near Nobunaga himself. The warlord personally filled his cup with sake and piled his plate with delicacies. He introduced Yasuke to his most famous generals, men like Shibata Katsuie and Hashiba Hideyoshi. To these hardened veterans, Yasuke was an unbelievable sight, but their lord's open and enthusiastic acceptance of him meant they had no choice but to follow suit. They saw that Nobunaga wasn't treating Yasuke as a pet or a curiosity anymore. He was treating him as a retainer, a man of potential worth. As the night wore on, Yasuke sat amidst the swirl of power, politics, and sake. Just that morning, he had been a nameless foreigner, a slave turned bodyguard who had caused a riot. Now he had a Japanese name, a seat at the table of the most powerful man in the land, and the focused attention of the entire ruling class. He had been stripped, scrubbed, and inspected like an animal, but he had emerged from the ordeal not humiliated, but elevated. His old life was over, severed as cleanly as if by a katana blade. He was now Yasuke, a man of the Oda clan. He had entered Honnoji as a servant, but he would walk out of it as something new, something unprecedented in the history of Japan, with a path laid before him that led directly into the heart of the samurai world. The days that followed were a crucible. Yasuke was immediately removed from the gentle, scholarly world of the Jesuits and thrust into the relentlessly martial environment of Nobunaga's inner circle.
His life, once measured by prayer times and the slow pace of Valignano's diplomatic missions, was now governed by the clang of steel on steel in the training yard and the sharp, barked commands of weapons masters. Nobunaga did not intend for Yasuke to be a mere decorative bodyguard, a towering ornament to stand beside his throne. The Demon King was a pragmatist above all else. He saw in Yasuke's raw strength and keen mind a weapon to be honed, and so he gave him over to his finest instructors. Yasuke's first test was in the sumo ring. Sumo was more than a sport to the samurai class. It was a fundamental measure of raw power and fighting spirit. Nobunaga, a keen practitioner himself, ordered a match between Yasuke and one of his champion wrestlers, a man renowned for his immense girth and strength, who had reportedly once thrown a small horse. The entire garrison of Azuchi Castle gathered to watch.
The Japanese wrestler, confident and sneering, charged. Yasuke, relying on instincts honed in a life of brutal, unstructured fighting, didn't try to match the sumo's technique. Instead, he met the charge with the force of a battering ram, his superior height and leverage allowing him to get under his opponent's center of gravity. With a roar that echoed across the courtyard, he lifted the stunned champion off his feet and slammed him to the ground with a force that shook the very earth. A wave of shocked silence was followed by a roar of approval, led by Nobunaga himself, who was laughing with delight. This victory earned Yasuke a measure of grudging respect, but raw strength was not enough. To be a true retainer, he had to master the weapons and disciplines of the samurai.
He was handed a yari, the long spear that was the staple of the Ashigaru foot soldier, and a naginata, the fearsome polearm with its curved blade. The weapons masters, initially skeptical, were soon astonished. Yasuke's physical power gave him an incredible advantage. He could handle a spear that was longer and heavier than the standard issue, giving him a reach advantage no Japanese soldier could match. His swings with the naginata were devastating, capable of shearing through bamboo practice targets that other warriors could only dent. But it was in the dojo, with the katana, that his true aptitude was revealed. The sword was the soul of the samurai, an extension of the warrior's spirit, demanding not just strength, but also precision, discipline, and a deep understanding of timing and distance. His instructor was one of the Oda clan's most respected swordsmen, an old, wiry master who had survived dozens of battles. He did not go easy on the foreigner. He drilled Yasuke from dawn until dusk, punishing every mistake, every moment of inattention with a sharp crack from a bamboo shinai. Yasuke's body became a canvas of bruises, but he never complained. He absorbed the lessons with a ferocious intensity. He learned the 8 basic cuts, the stances, the parries. He learned to feel his opponent's intention through the subtle shifts in their posture, the flicker in their eyes. His movements, once reliant on brute force, became more fluid, more economical. He began to think not just like a fighter, but like a swordsman. Nobunaga watched his progress with keen interest. He would often summon Yasuke to his private chambers, not for training, but for conversation.
He would ask Yasuke about the tactics of African tribes, the fortifications of Portuguese trading posts, the design of the great ships that crossed the oceans. To Nobunaga, Yasuke was a living encyclopedia of a world he could never see for himself. This relationship was unprecedented. No other retainer, not even his most senior generals, was granted such frequent and informal access. Yasuke became more than a soldier. He became a confidant. He was an outsider, with no family connections, no historical clan loyalties, and no political ambitions within the complex web of Japanese feudalism. He was, in a sense, the only man Nobunaga could trust completely, for his loyalty was to Nobunaga alone. This rapid elevation did not go unnoticed, and it bred resentment. Some of the older, more traditionalist samurai saw Yasuke as an affront. He was a foreigner, a man of unknown birth, a former slave, who had been elevated above men who had served the Oda clan for generations. They whispered behind his back, calling him Nobunaga's black pet. They would challenge him in the training yard, hoping to humiliate him and prove he was unworthy of his station. These challenges were a dangerous game. Yasuke had to win to maintain his honor, but he could not win too brutally, lest he deeply offend a powerful retainer and create a blood feud. He learned to navigate this treacherous social landscape with the same skill he was developing with a sword, often disarming or subduing his opponents without inflicting serious injury, a feat which required far more skill than simply cutting them down. The ultimate sign of Nobunaga's favor came within a year of his arrival. In a formal ceremony, Nobunaga presented Yasuke with 2 gifts of almost unimaginable significance. The first was a private residence within the grounds of Azuchi Castle, a privilege reserved for only the most trusted family members and retainers. The second gift took away the breath of every man present. Nobunaga presented him with a katana. This was not a standard issue weapon. It was a blade of exquisite quality, its scabbard decorated with gold fittings bearing the Oda clan crest. The gift of a sword from a daimyo to his retainer was the ultimate symbol of acceptance. It meant that Nobunaga officially recognized Yasuke as a samurai, a warrior, a member of the ruling military class. The former slave of a Jesuit priest was now, by the decree of the most powerful man in the land, a samurai.
He was given a stipend, a retinue of his own servants, and the right to wear the daisho, the paired long and short swords that were the exclusive badge of his new rank. Yasuke became a constant presence at Nobunaga's side. He was part of the Lord's personal honor guard, the Kudo Horo Shu, an elite unit of messengers and bodyguards, instantly recognizable by the black lacquered capes they wore on their backs. He stood guard during councils of war, his imposing figure a silent warning to any who might consider treachery. He accompanied Nobunaga on falconry hunts and to tea ceremonies. The Japanese chronicles of the time, such as the Shinjo Koki, the Chronicle of Lord Nobunaga, explicitly mention him, a testament to the profound impression he made on his contemporaries. He wasn't just a footnote, he was a recognized figure in the Oda court. His martial prowess was soon tested in real combat. In 1581, Nobunaga launched his final brutal campaign to pacify Iga province, the mountain's homeland of the infamous Iga ninja clans.
The campaign was less a battle and more an extermination. The Oda army, tens of thousands strong, poured into the province, burning villages and hunting down ninja warriors and their hidden strongholds. Yasuke was in the thick of it, fighting as part of Nobunaga's personal guard. Here, the sterile environment of the dojo was replaced by the chaotic horror of the battlefield. He fought in desperate skirmishes in dense forests and smoky, burning villages. He saw firsthand the ruthlessness of his lord and the brutal reality of the Sengoku Jidai. He proved himself not just a skilled duelist, but a ferocious and dependable warrior, protecting Nobunaga's person against ambush and surprise attacks from the shadows. He had earned his katana not just as a gift, but in blood and battle. By the summer of 1582, Nobunaga stood at the absolute zenith of his power. He had crushed the Takeda clan, his last major rival. The country was, for all intents and purposes, his. All that remained was to formalize his rule, perhaps by taking the title of shogun. To celebrate his victories, he invited his key ally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, to a lavish banquet in Azuchi. Yasuke stood guard during the feast, a black-armored giant, the ultimate symbol of Nobunaga's power and his embrace of the strange and the new. After the banquet, Nobunaga decided to move to his headquarters in Kyoto, the same Honnoji temple where he had first met Yasuke, to prepare for a new campaign to the west. He traveled with only a small contingent of his personal guard and pages, perhaps 100 men in total. He was so secure in his power, so certain of the loyalty of his vassals, that he felt no need for a larger force.
It was the greatest miscalculation of his life. One of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, had been ordered to lead his own army of 13,000 men west to support the campaign. But on the night of June 20th, under the cover of darkness, Mitsuhide changed his orders. He turned his entire army around and began marching them not west, but east, towards Kyoto, towards Honnoji. When one of his captains questioned the order, asking where they were going, Mitsuhide uttered the most infamous words in Japanese history: "The enemy is at Honnoji." In the pre-dawn hours of June 21st, 1582, Yasuke was awoken by a sound he knew intimately, the sound of war. It wasn't a skirmish, it was the roar of a full-scale assault. Arrows rained down into the temple courtyards like black hail. The crackle of arquebus fire was deafening. Shouts of "Teki wa Honnoji ni ari" echoed from all sides. The Akechi army, flying their bellflower crest, was storming the temple. Nobunaga, with less than 100 men, was trapped, betrayed, surrounded by 13,000 enemy soldiers. Yasuke seized his spear and his katana and rushed to his lord's side. He found Nobunaga, clad in his night robes, already fighting, armed with a bow, cutting down the first wave of attackers who burst into his private chambers. The handful of pages and guards, including the young Mori Ranmaru and his brothers, formed a desperate, hopeless circle around their master. The battle was a maelstrom of blood, splintering wood, and fire. The temple had been set alight, and the smoke was thick and choking. Yasuke fought like a cornered lion. His great height and reach, combined with the devastating power of his spear, made him a whirlwind of death.
He held the main doorway against wave after wave of Akechi samurai, his spear a blur, his armor slick with blood, his own and that of his enemies. For a brief, glorious moment, this lone African warrior held back an entire army. But it could not last. Nobunaga was struck in the shoulder by an arrow. Then he was shot in the arm by an arquebus ball. Wounded and realizing the end was near, he retreated into the burning temple's inner sanctum. A samurai lord's final duty was to deny his enemy his head. He was going to commit seppuku. Yasuke and the few remaining guards fought on, a desperate last stand to give their lord time to die with honor. They were hopelessly outnumbered, fighting in a raging inferno. One by one, they fell. Mori Ranmaru was killed. His brothers were killed. Finally, only Yasuke was left, wounded, exhausted, surrounded by a sea of enemies in a collapsing, burning building. The Demon King was dead. The dream of a unified Japan was in ashes, and Yasuke, the African samurai, was about to face his final battle. Final battle. The heat was an all-consuming monster, stealing the air from his lungs. Flames licked up the paper screens and wooden pillars, roaring like a dragon as the roof of Hanoji began to groan under its own weight. Through the swirling smoke and embers, the faces of Akechi samurai were demonic masks, their eyes wide with a mixture of battle lust and awe. They had expected to fight Oda Nobunaga's guards, but they had not expected to face a black giant who fought with the fury of a vengeful god.
He was bleeding from a dozen cuts, his armor dented and scorched, but he stood his ground over the bodies of his fallen comrades, his katana now in his hands, its once pristine blade chipped and stained. Akechi Mitsuhide's senior commander, a man named Akechi Samanosuke, pushed through the ranks of his soldiers. He had seen the carnage Yasuke had wrought at the temple gates. He saw the pile of his own men lying dead at the foreigner's feet. He could have ordered his arquebusiers to gun him down, or his spearmen to overwhelm him with sheer numbers, but something held him back. There was no honor in butchering a cornered animal, and this man, whatever his origins, had fought with more courage and loyalty than anyone Samanosuke had ever witnessed. This was not an animal. This was a warrior, a true bushi. "Surrender!" Samanosuke bellowed over the roar of the fire. "Your lord is dead. There is no more reason to fight." Yasuke's chest heaved, his body screaming with exhaustion and pain. He looked at the sea of enemy soldiers, at the burning temple, where the man who had given him a name, a purpose, and a home now lay dead. For him, there was every reason to fight. His loyalty, his entire identity as a samurai, was bound to Oda Nobunaga. Death in his master's service was the only honorable path left. He raised his katana in a gesture of defiance. Seeing that words were useless, Samanosuke signaled for his men to attack. But they hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to charge the black demon. Finally, spurred on by their officers, a group of samurai surged forward. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided.
Yasuke, weakened by his wounds and exhaustion, was a shadow of his former self. He cut down 2 more men before a spear shaft slammed into the back of his knee, buckling his leg. Another caught him in the side, piercing his armor. He stumbled, falling to one knee, but still he tried to fight, swinging his sword wildly. Finally, the flat of a blade crashed against the side of his head. The world dissolved into a blinding flash of white, and then darkness. When Yasuke awoke, the world was ash and silence. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only the charred skeletons of the temple buildings against a smoke-filled sky. His hands were bound behind his back. His wounds had been crudely bandaged. He was a prisoner. Akechi's men dragged him from the ruins and presented him to their lord, Mitsuhide. Akechi Mitsuhide, the betrayer, the man now poised to become the new master of Japan, looked down at the captive. He saw the giant frame, the dark skin, the defiant eyes. He knew who this was. Everyone in the upper echelons of the Oda clan knew of Nobunaga's African retainer. Mitsuhide's generals urged him to execute Yasuke immediately. He was a symbol of Nobunaga's power, a loyalist who would surely seek revenge if allowed to live. But Mitsuhide hesitated. He was a scholar and a poet as well as a general, a man of complex and often contradictory impulses. He looked at Yasuke and saw not just an enemy soldier, but a profound anomaly.
"This man is not Japanese," he declared, his voice heavy with thought. "He is a beast, an animal from the land of the black people. He does not understand reason or the concept of honor as we do."
He fought only because his master fed him. To kill him would be pointless. It would be like killing a dumb creature. The pronouncement was both an insult and a salvation. By declaring Yasuke a beast, Mitsuhide was stripping him of his samurai status, denying the very identity Nobunaga had bestowed upon him. He was erasing him from the narrative of the samurai class. But in doing so, he was also absolving him of the need to die. A samurai prisoner was expected to commit seppuku or be executed. A beast, however, could simply be discarded. "Take him to the Nambanji," Mitsuhide ordered, referring to the Jesuit church in Kyoto. "Give him back to the southern barbarians. They will know what to do with him." And so Yasuke was spared. He was hauled through the streets of Kyoto, no longer a celebrated retainer, but a disgraced captive. The crowds that had once rioted to get a glimpse of him now stared in silent pity or contempt. He was delivered to the Jesuit mission, wounded, dishonored, and stripped of everything he had. The priests who took him in could scarcely believe their eyes. Here was the man who had been taken from them by the most powerful lord in the land, now returned to them in rags, his grand adventure in the world of the samurai having ended in catastrophe and blood. The historical record of Yasuke grows faint after this point. His fate becomes a matter of speculation, a ghost story whispered at the edges of history. The Jesuit records mention his return to their care, but what happened next is unclear. Some theories suggest he may have traveled with the returning Alessandro Valignano, leaving Japan forever and perhaps ending his days in India or back in Africa.
Others believe he may have entered the service of another daimyo, his combat experience making him a valuable asset. There are even tantalizing but unproven accounts of a powerfully built African warrior fighting in the service of Nobunaga's heir, Oda Nobunaga, in the years following the Honnoji incident. But his legacy, the verifiable part of his story, is what truly matters. In the rigidly hierarchical, ethnically homogeneous society of Sengoku Japan, Yasuke achieved the impossible. He transcended his origins as a nameless, stateless slave to become a landed nobleman, a trusted confidant, and a recognized samurai in the court of the most powerful man in the nation's history. He was not a passive observer. He was an active participant in the great violent drama of his time. He learned the language, the culture, and the deadly arts of a world that was utterly alien to him, and he mastered them. His story is a testament not only to his own incredible strength, intelligence, and adaptability, but also to the strange, paradoxical nature of his patron, Oda Nobunaga. The Demon King, for all his brutality, was a man who prized merit and novelty above all else. He was capable of seeing past the color of a man's skin to recognize the warrior that lay beneath. In Yasuke, Nobunaga found a kindred spirit, an outsider, a disruptor, a man of immense power who did not fit the traditional molds. The reign of Akechi Mitsuhide, the man who spared Yasuke's life, lasted only 13 days. He was swiftly defeated and killed by another of Nobunaga's generals, Hashiba Hideyoshi, who would go on to complete the unification of Japan. The age of war would end, and the age of the Tokugawa shogunate would begin.
Japan would once again turn inwards, closing its borders to the outside world for over 200 years. The brief, violent, and vibrant period of cultural exchange that had allowed a man like Yasuke to rise would be extinguished. His story, once common knowledge in the courts of the powerful, would fade into the realm of obscure historical trivia, a curious footnote in the epic tale of the samurai. But he was never entirely forgotten. He remains a singular figure, a man who stands alone in the annals of Japanese history. He walked a path that no one before or since has ever walked. He was the foreign bodyguard who caused a riot, the beast who was scrubbed clean for a king, the slave who was gifted a sword and a name. He was Yasuke, the first and only African samurai.